The late summer sun cast long shadows across Oakhaven Cemetery as Elias, head groundskeeper for the past 20 years, locked the wrought iron gates. He was a man of routine, of quiet observation. He knew the rhythm of the cemetery as well as he knew the beating of his own heart. And lately, the rhythm had been off. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A stillness, more profound than usual, had settled over the grounds. The squirrels, normally frantic in their preparations for winter, were absent. The birds, usually a cacophony of chirps and songs, were silent. It was as if the entire ecosystem held its breath. Elias initially attributed it to a change in the barometric pressure, a precursor to a storm. But the skies remained clear, the air still. Then came the rustling. Not the gentle whisper of leaves in a breeze, but a deeper, more resonant sound. It was as if the trees themselves were sighing. A collective exhalation that vibrated through the very ground beneath his feet. He'd checked for wind, of course, looked up into the canopy for any sign of movement. But the leaves hung motionless. The rustling seemed to emanate from within the trees, from the very core of their being. Elias, a man of science and practicality, dismissed it as an auditory illusion. The mind, he knew, could play tricks, especially after a long day's work under the relentless sun. He poured himself a glass of iced tea, sat on his porch, and tried to ignore the persistent rustling that seemed to follow him even indoors. The next day, it was worse. The stillness was heavier, more oppressive. Even the insects were silent, and the rustling had intensified, morphing into something else. It was no longer just the sound of leaves. It was a low, guttural murmur, a series of clicks and groans that seemed to come from the trees' trunks themselves. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias heard it clearly for the first time, a distinct vocalization. It wasn't a language he recognized, not English, not Spanish, not anything he'd ever heard before. It was a complex series of clicks, whistles, and guttural tones, organized in a way that suggested meaning. It was alien, unsettling, and utterly captivating. He grabbed his old binoculars and walked back into the cemetery, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. He focused on the oldest oak tree, a gnarled behemoth that had stood sentinel over the graves for centuries. The sound seemed to be coming from it. He strained his ears, trying to decipher the strange language. It was then that he noticed something else. The bark of the oak was shifting, not in a dramatic way, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. It was as if the tree's skin was rippling, contorting itself to form strange, unfamiliar patterns. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. A primal fear that had nothing to do with logic or reason. He was a man who found comfort in the predictable cycles of nature, in the quiet dignity of the cemetery. But this was something entirely different. This was a violation of the natural order, a disruption of the delicate balance he had always cherished. He retreated back to his cottage, locking the door behind him. He told himself it was the wind, the old trees creaking, his imagination running wild. He poured himself a stronger drink, trying to drown out the unsettling sounds that echoed in his mind. But as he sat there in the darkness, listening to the alien language emanating from the trees outside, he knew, deep down, that something profound and terrible was happening. The world, as he knew it, was changing, and he had a feeling that Oakhaven Cemetery was just the beginning. Elias wasn't the only one hearing things. The next morning, fueled by a sleepless night and copious amounts of coffee, he hesitantly typed strange tree sounds into his search engine. He expected nothing, perhaps a few crackpot theories about government conspiracies or alien invasions. What he found was far more unsettling. A small, obscure subreddit, r/The Whispering Woods, was filled with similar accounts. People from all over the world were reporting the same phenomena: unnerving silences, unusual rustling, and the unmistakable sound of vocalizations coming from trees. Initially, the posts were dismissed as elaborate hoaxes, creative writing exercises, or the product of overactive imaginations. But as the days passed, the number of reports grew exponentially, their consistency becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. A woman in Sweden described hearing a chorus of low moans emanating from the birch forest behind her house. A hiker in the Appalachian Mountains wrote of a series of high-pitched whistles that seemed to follow him through the woods. A city dweller in Tokyo posted a recording of rhythmic clicks coming from the bonsai tree on his balcony. The comment sections were a mix of disbelief, fear, and morbid curiosity. Some users attempted to debunk the claims, attributing the sounds to wind, animals, or even elaborate pranks. Others shared their own experiences, adding to the growing sense of unease. A few brave souls attempted to record and analyze the sounds, hoping to find a rational explanation, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. The recordings were often distorted, filled with static and background noise, and even when clear recordings were obtained, they yielded no discernible patterns or structures. The sounds remained stubbornly alien, resistant to any form of linguistic analysis. Elias scrolled through the subreddit, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't hallucinating. Something truly extraordinary was happening. And it was happening on a global scale. He read a post from a botanist in Brazil who claimed to have observed similar shifts in the bark of trees in the Amazon rainforest. Another post from a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park described a palpable sense of unease among the wildlife, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The sheer volume of reports, coupled with their geographical diversity, suggested that this wasn't just a local phenomenon. It wasn't limited to Oak Haven Cemetery. It was a planetary event, a global awakening of the arboreal world. The mainstream media, of course, remained largely silent. The reports were too bizarre, too outlandish to be taken seriously. But in the shadowy corners of the internet, a different narrative was emerging, a narrative of impending doom. Conspiracy theories flourished, ranging from the plausible, a new form of plant communication triggered by climate change, to the absurd, an alien invasion orchestrated by sentient trees. Elias closed his laptop, his mind reeling. He felt a sense of isolation, but also a strange sense of connection to the anonymous voices on the internet. He wasn't alone in his fear, in his bewilderment. Millions of people around the world were experiencing the same unsettling phenomena. He looked out the window at the trees in the cemetery, their silhouettes stark against the darkening sky. They were silent now, but he knew they were listening. He could feel their presence, a silent, watchful intelligence that permeated the very air around him. He wondered what they were saying, what secrets they held. And he wondered what would happen when their message finally broke through, when the world could no longer ignore the whispers of the woods. The global awakening had begun, and Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that humanity was woefully unprepared. While the world outside continued to dismiss the tree speak as mass hysteria, Dr. Vivian Holloway, a renowned linguist specializing in extinct and obscure languages, found herself increasingly drawn to the phenomenon. Initially, she'd scoffed at the online reports, relegating them to the realm of pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. But a nagging curiosity, a professional itch she couldn't quite scratch, compelled her to investigate further. Vivian was a woman of rigorous methodology, of meticulous analysis. She didn't believe in ghosts or goblins, but she did believe in patterns, in the underlying structures that govern all forms of communication, whether human or otherwise. She began by collecting as many recordings of the tree language as she could find, scouring the r/the Whispering Woods subreddit and other online forums. She filtered out the obvious fakes and hoaxes, focusing on the recordings that seemed to exhibit genuine consistency. Her initial attempts to analyze the sounds were frustrating. The recordings were often noisy and distorted, making it difficult to isolate individual sounds. The sheer complexity of the vocalizations was also daunting. The tree language seemed to lack the clear, distinct phonemes that characterized human languages. Instead, it was a fluid, ever-shifting tapestry of clicks, whistles, groans, and rustling sounds, interwoven in a seemingly random fashion. But Vivian was not easily discouraged. She spent weeks poring over the recordings, applying various acoustic analysis techniques, filtering out background noise, and isolating individual sound events. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to discern patterns. She noticed that certain sounds tended to cluster together, forming distinct units. She identified recurring sequences, rhythmic patterns, and variations in pitch and intonation. She started to suspect that the tree language, while alien and unfamiliar, was not entirely random. It possessed an underlying structure, a grammar of sorts. She began to develop a rudimentary phonetic alphabet, assigning symbols to the various sounds she had identified. She experimented with different grammatical models, trying to find one that could account for the observed patterns. The breakthrough came late one night, after weeks of relentless work. Vivian was analyzing a recording of a tree in the Black Forest of Germany when she noticed a recurring sequence of sounds that seemed to correlate with changes in the tree's physical state. The tree's branches would sway slightly. Its leaves would rustle in a particular way, and then the sequence of sounds would be emitted. Vivian hypothesized that the sequence was a form of deixis, a way of referring to the immediate context. She began to experiment with different interpretations, trying to find one that made sense. And then, suddenly it clicked. She realized that the sequence was referring to the sun. It was a rudimentary form of sun, a way of acknowledging the star that provided the tree with life-giving energy. The realization sent a jolt of excitement through Vivian. She had cracked the code. She had found the key to unlocking the secrets of the tree language. She spent the next few days refining her analysis, testing her hypothesis against other recordings. And to her astonishment, it held up. She was able to identify other rudimentary words, referring to water, earth, wind, and other elements of the tree's environment. She was even able to discern basic grammatical structures, indicating relationships between these words. Vivian had made a monumental discovery. She had proven that trees were not just passive organisms, but sentient beings capable of complex communication. But she also knew that her discovery would be met with skepticism, disbelief, and even ridicule. She had to proceed carefully, gathering more evidence, refining her analysis, and preparing to defend her findings against the inevitable onslaught of criticism. The journey had just begun, and Vivian knew that it would be a long and arduous one. But she was determined to uncover the truth. No matter the cost. Vivian's initial excitement soon gave way to a chilling realization. She expanded her vocabulary and refined her understanding of the tree language. The content of their communication became increasingly disturbing. The trees weren't simply discussing the weather or their immediate surroundings. They were expressing something far more profound, far more unsettling: anger. The early translations were fragmented and ambiguous, but the underlying sentiment was undeniable. The trees were communicating a deep-seated resentment, a sense of violation and betrayal. They spoke of a world out of balance, of a wound inflicted upon the earth, of a parasitic infestation that was slowly draining the planet's lifeblood. As Vivian delved deeper, she began to decipher more explicit warnings. The trees spoke of unsustainable human practices, of rampant deforestation, of the poisoning of the land and the sea. They described the devastating impact of pollution on their health and well-being, the slow, agonizing death of their brethren. They warned of a coming reckoning, a time when the earth would reclaim what had been stolen from it. What was truly astonishing, and deeply unsettling, was the sheer antiquity of the language. Vivian discovered echoes of proto-languages, remnants of ancient tongues that had vanished from human memory millennia ago. The tree language seemed to tap into a linguistic reservoir far older than any known human civilization, hinting at a sentience that stretched back eons, predating the rise of humanity itself. This realization sent shivers down Vivian's spine. She was not simply deciphering a new language. She was uncovering a hidden history, a secret narrative of the planet's past. She began to suspect that the trees were not just individual organisms, but interconnected nodes in a vast, ancient network, a planetary consciousness that had been silently observing humanity for centuries. The anger expressed in the tree language was not a sudden outburst, but a slow burn, a simmering resentment that had been building for generations. The trees had witnessed the rise of humanity, its relentless expansion, its insatiable appetite for resources. They had watched as forests were felled, rivers were dammed, and the air was poisoned, and they had remained silent, patiently waiting for a moment when they could finally make their voices heard. Vivian began to feel a profound sense of guilt, a burden of responsibility for the actions of her species. She realized that humanity was not just destroying the environment, it was silencing a voice, a wisdom that had been accumulated over millennia. She felt a desperate urge to warn the world, to share her findings with the scientific community, to alert the public to the impending danger. But she also knew that her claims would be met with skepticism and ridicule. The idea that trees could communicate, that they possessed a collective consciousness, that they were angry at humanity, it was simply too outlandish, too unbelievable for most people to accept. She needed more evidence, more concrete proof to convince the world that she was not simply a deluded academic. She decided to focus her efforts on deciphering the most urgent warnings, the specific threats that the trees were communicating. She hoped that by identifying these threats, she could provide a tangible reason for humanity to listen, a compelling incentive to change its ways. The fate of the planet, she realized, might depend on her ability to translate the fury of the trees into a language that humanity could understand. The whispers became shouts. The rustling, a roar. The trees, it seemed, were no longer content with subtle warnings. Their message was escalating, growing more urgent, more aggressive. The language itself was evolving, becoming more complex, more nuanced, and undeniably more threatening. Vivian noticed the change first in the recordings. The earlier vocalizations had been relatively simple, consisting of basic words and grammatical structures. Now, the trees were stringing together long, complex sentences, using metaphors and analogies that were both beautiful and terrifying. The tone had shifted from resentment to outright hostility. The warnings became threats. The trees spoke of droughts, floods, and wildfires, of plagues and pestilence. They described the slow, agonizing death that awaited humanity if it continued on its current path. They warned of a time when the earth would shake off its human infestation like a dog shaking off fleas. But the escalation wasn't just linguistic. The trees were also becoming more vocal, their voices growing louder and more pervasive. The sounds were no longer confined to forests and parks. They were echoing through cities, towns, and villages, disrupting the peace and tranquility of everyday life. And perhaps most disturbingly, the sounds were beginning to affect people psychologically. Reports surfaced of increased anxiety, paranoia, and depression. People were experiencing vivid nightmares, filled with images of dying forests and burning cities. Some even reported physical symptoms, such as headaches, nausea, and dizziness. Elias, back in Oak Haven Cemetery, was experiencing this firsthand. The tree's vocalizations had become a constant presence in his life, a relentless barrage of clicks, whistles, and groans that filled his waking hours and haunted his dreams. He found it increasingly difficult to concentrate, to sleep, to even think clearly. The sounds seemed to be burrowing into his mind, twisting his thoughts, and amplifying his fears. He wasn't alone. On the r/The Whispering Woods subreddit, people were sharing similar experiences. Some reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, a premonition of impending doom. Others described feeling a deep-seated anger, a burning resentment towards humanity for its destruction of the environment. A few even claimed to be able to understand the tree language, to hear the specific threats and warnings that were being communicated. These individuals were often dismissed as delusional or mentally unstable, but their accounts were eerily consistent, echoing the translations that Vivian had been working on. The mainstream media, finally unable to ignore the growing public outcry, began to report on the phenomenon. But their coverage was often sensationalized and misleading, focusing on the more outlandish conspiracy theories and downplaying the scientific evidence. Vivian, desperate to get her message across, reached out to several journalists and scientists, hoping to find someone who would take her seriously. But most dismissed her as a crackpot, a well-meaning academic who had lost touch with reality. As the world spiraled further into chaos, Vivian felt a growing sense of despair. She had uncovered a profound truth, a warning that could save humanity from self-destruction. But no one was listening. The trees were screaming, but their voices were being drowned out by the noise and distractions of modern life. The escalation had begun, and Vivian feared that it was only a matter of time before the trees unleashed their full fury upon the world. The psychological effects of the tree speak intensified. and the sheer volume of reports became impossible to ignore. Governments and scientific institutions could no longer remain on the sidelines. Emergency task forces were formed, research grants were hastily approved, and teams of experts were assembled to investigate the phenomenon. But the very nature of the crisis defied easy categorization, leading to a proliferation of conflicting theories and a growing sense of confusion. Within the scientific community, opinions were sharply divided. Some clung to rational explanations, proposing that the tree speak was a previously unknown form of plant communication, perhaps triggered by environmental stress or some other external stimulus. They hypothesized that the trees were emitting ultrasonic signals or releasing volatile organic compounds that were being interpreted as sound by the human brain. Others ventured into more speculative territory, suggesting that the tree speak was evidence of a Gaia-like consciousness awakening, a planetary intelligence that had been dormant for millennia. They argued that the Earth itself was a living organism, and that the trees were its sensory organs, its means of communicating with the outside world. Then there were those who leaned towards the supernatural, attributing the tree speak to demonic possession, ancient curses, or even alien intervention. These theories, while dismissed by most scientists, gained traction among certain segments of the population, fueling religious fervor and apocalyptic paranoia. The lack of a clear consensus, coupled with the increasingly disturbing nature of the tree speak, led to mass panic. People, driven to the brink by anxiety and fear, began to lash out. Superstition took root. If the trees were angry, then they needed to be silenced. The first acts of violence were isolated incidents: a tree chopped down in a suburban backyard, a park vandalized with graffiti. But as the panic spread, these incidents became more frequent and more organized. Vigilante groups formed, roaming the streets with axes and chainsaws, targeting any tree that dared to speak. Elias watched in horror as the trees in Oak Haven Cemetery were attacked. Headstones were overturned, branches were hacked off, and trunks were scarred with graffiti. The air was filled with the sounds of screaming chainsaws and the sickening thud of falling timber. He tried to intervene, to reason with the vandals, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. They saw him as an old fool, a tree hugger who was standing in the way of their survival. The violence spread like wildfire, engulfing cities and towns across the globe. Forests were burned, parks were bulldozed, and even potted plants were smashed to pieces. The world seemed to be at war with itself, with humanity turning against the very source of its life and sustenance. Vivian, witnessing the unfolding chaos from her isolated research lab, felt a profound sense of despair. Her efforts to warn the world had backfired, leading to a wave of violence and destruction that was only exacerbating the problem. She realized that she had underestimated the power of fear, the irrationality of the human mind when confronted with the unknown. She knew that she had to do something, anything, to stop the madness. But she was just one person, a lone voice in a world consumed by panic and paranoia. She felt like a doctor standing on a battlefield, desperately trying to save lives while bombs exploded all around her. The trees were screaming, humanity was dying, and Vivian was running out of time. Despite the widespread chaos and violence, a glimmer of hope emerged. Vivian, finally managing to convince a small group of open-minded scientists and tech experts to join her, secured funding for a more comprehensive investigation. Using advanced signal processing techniques and global mapping data, the team began to analyze the origins and patterns of the tree speak with renewed vigor. They hypothesized that the tree speak, despite its global reach, was not uniformly distributed. Instead, it seemed to emanate from specific geographical hotspots, regions where the intensity of the vocalizations was significantly higher. By cross-referencing these hotspots with satellite imagery and environmental data, they hoped to pinpoint the source of the tree's collective anger. After weeks of painstaking analysis, the team identified a clear epicenter, a remote region of the Siberian taiga, a vast expanse of boreal forest, stretching across northern Russia. The data showed a dramatic spike in tree speak activity originating from this area, far exceeding anything recorded elsewhere on the planet. Intrigued, Vivian and her team delved deeper into the situation in the taiga. They discovered that a massive logging operation was underway, spearheaded by a multinational corporation with dubious environmental practices. The company was clear-cutting vast swathes of ancient forest, destroying habitats, and releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Satellite images revealed a gaping wound in the heart of the taiga, a scar that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The logging operation was not only destroying the forest, but also disrupting the delicate ecological balance of the region, threatening the survival of countless species. The team realized that they had found the source of the tree's anger. The logging operation in the Siberian taiga was not just an isolated act of environmental destruction. It was a catalyst, an amplifier that was intensifying the tree's collective rage and broadcasting it across the globe. The trees, it seemed, were reacting to the destruction of their brethren, to the violation of their sacred space. Vivian felt a surge of righteous indignation. The logging operation was a crime against nature, a blatant disregard for the planet's well-being. She knew that she had to expose the truth, to bring the perpetrators to justice. But she also knew that she was up against powerful forces. The multinational corporation behind the logging operation had deep pockets and strong political connections. They would stop at nothing to protect their interests, to silence anyone who threatened their profits. Vivian and her team decided to leak their findings to the press, hoping that public outrage would force the corporation to halt its operations. They contacted several investigative journalists, providing them with irrefutable evidence of the environmental destruction and the link to the tree speak phenomenon. The story broke a few days later, sending shockwaves across the globe. The mainstream media, finally taking the tree speak phenomenon seriously, ran the story on their front pages, exposing the corporation's unethical practices and highlighting the urgent need for environmental protection. Public outrage was immediate and widespread. Protests erupted outside the corporation's headquarters, demanding an end to the logging operation and calling for stricter environmental regulations. Governments launched investigations, and international organizations condemned the corporation's actions. The corporation, facing mounting pressure, was forced to suspend its operations in the Siberian taiga. But the damage had already been done. The trees had spoken, humanity had listened, but the wound in the earth remained, a festering sore that continued to fuel the tree's collective anger. Even amidst the cacophony of anger and threats, a subtle counterpoint began to emerge. Vivian, sifting through the endless stream of recordings, noticed a distinct shift in the vocalizations emanating from certain trees. These were not the voices of rage and retribution, but of hope and supplication. It was a smaller subset, a minority voice within the larger chorus, but it was undeniably present. These trees seemed to be pleading with humanity, offering a path to reconciliation, a promise of peace if humanity would only change its ways. Their language was softer, more melodic, filled with images of healing and renewal. They spoke of the interconnectedness of all living things, of the delicate balance that sustained life on Earth. They reminded humanity of its responsibility as stewards of the planet, of its duty to protect and preserve the natural world. They offered a vision of a future where humans and trees could coexist in harmony, where forests could thrive, and where the earth could heal its wounds. The message was clear. The trees were willing to forgive humanity for its past transgressions, but only if it demonstrated a genuine commitment to change. They offered a truce, a promise to cease their attacks if humanity altered its course, embraced sustainable practices, and restored the balance of nature. Vivian was deeply moved by this plea for understanding. It gave her a renewed sense of hope, a belief that humanity was not beyond redemption. She knew that she had to amplify this message, to make it heard above the din of anger and fear. She began to focus her research on these trees of hope, studying their language, mapping their locations, and trying to understand what made them different from the other trees. She discovered that they were often located in areas that had been subjected to severe environmental damage, places where the trees had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of human activity. These trees, it seemed, had chosen a different path, a path of forgiveness and reconciliation. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they still believed in its potential for good. They were the voice of reason in a world gone mad, the beacon of light in a sea of darkness. Vivian reached out to the media, sharing her findings and urging them to focus on the message of hope. She argued that the tree speak was not just a threat, but also an opportunity, a chance for humanity to learn from its mistakes and build a better future. Some journalists were receptive to her message, publishing articles and airing documentaries that highlighted the plea for understanding. But others remained skeptical, focusing on the sensational aspects of the tree speak phenomenon and downplaying the possibility of reconciliation. The public response was mixed. Some people were inspired by the message of hope, embracing sustainable practices and advocating for environmental protection. Others remained fearful and distrustful, convinced that the trees were simply lulling humanity into a false sense of security before launching a final, devastating attack. Elias, back in Oak Haven Cemetery, found himself drawn to a small grove of oak trees that seemed to radiate a sense of peace and tranquility. He spent hours sitting beneath their branches, listening to their gentle rustling, and feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. He believed that these trees held the key to humanity's survival, that their message of forgiveness and reconciliation was the only way to avert disaster. Humanity stood at a crossroads, teetering on the brink of either salvation or self-destruction. The message from the trees, both the angry warnings and the hopeful pleas, had fractured society, creating deep divisions that threatened to tear it apart. On one side were those who listened to the tree's message of reconciliation, recognizing the urgent need for drastic environmental reforms. They formed grassroots movements, advocating for sustainable practices, renewable energy, and the protection of forests and wildlife. They pressured governments to enact stricter environmental regulations, and they boycotted corporations that were contributing to the destruction of the planet. These tree huggers, as they were derisively called by their opponents, were often ridiculed and marginalized. But their numbers were growing, fueled by a growing awareness of the environmental crisis and a deep-seated fear of the tree's wrath. On the other side were those who dismissed the tree speak as madness, as a mass delusion fueled by fear and superstition. They refused to believe that trees could communicate, let alone pose a threat to humanity. They saw the environmental movement as a threat to economic growth and individual freedom. These tree haters, as they were known in more sympathetic circles, called for the trees to be silenced permanently. They advocated for widespread deforestation, arguing that it was necessary to protect human settlements and infrastructure from the trees' attacks. They lobbied governments to authorize the use of chemical defoliants and genetically modified organisms to eradicate the tree's ability to communicate. Governments, caught in the middle, struggled to maintain order as society descended into chaos. The tree speak had become a political flashpoint, dividing nations and pitting communities against each other. Law enforcement agencies were stretched thin, trying to contain the violence and prevent further environmental destruction. The r/the Whispering Woods subreddit, once a haven for those seeking answers, had become a battleground for ideological warfare. Trolls and bots spread misinformation and propaganda, fueling the divisions and exacerbating the tensions. The moderators struggled to maintain control, banning users and deleting posts that violated the subreddit's rules. But the chaos continued to escalate. Vivian, exhausted and disheartened, watched as her efforts to warn the world spiraled out of control. She had hoped to unite humanity in a common cause, to inspire them to protect the planet and build a better future. But instead, she had unleashed a wave of fear, hatred, and violence that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Elias, back in Oak Haven Cemetery, felt a growing sense of despair. The violence had subsided somewhat, but the divisions remained, simmering beneath the surface. He continued to tend to the trees, offering them his protection and listening to their messages of hope. He believed that it was still possible for humanity to change, to choose a path of peace and reconciliation. But he feared that time was running out. The choice, he knew, would determine the fate of the world. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling silence. The tree speak, which had been a constant presence for months, abruptly ceased. The world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence lasted for 3 days. 3 days of unnerving quiet, of an almost palpable tension that hung in the air like a gathering storm. 3 days for humanity to make its choice. On the 4th day, the trees spoke again. But this time, Their message was different. It was no longer a cacophony of anger and threats, nor was it the gentle plea for reconciliation. It was a clear, concise declaration of intent. In some parts of the world, where communities had embraced sustainable practices and demonstrated a genuine commitment to environmental protection, the trees offered a message of peace. They promised to cease their attacks, to restore the balance of nature, and to coexist in harmony with humanity. In these regions, a period of healing began. The forests began to regenerate, the rivers ran clean, and the air was filled with the sounds of birdsong and laughter. People worked together to rebuild their communities, embracing sustainable technologies and fostering a deep respect for the natural world. Vivian, witnessing this transformation, felt a surge of hope. She had dedicated her life to understanding the trees, and now she was seeing the fruits of her labor. Humanity, it seemed, had chosen the path of salvation. But in other parts of the world, where governments had continued to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection, the trees delivered a different message. They declared war on humanity, vowing to reclaim what had been stolen from them. In these regions, a wave of environmental disasters erupted. Droughts, floods, and wildfires ravaged the land, decimating crops and destroying settlements. The trees themselves became weapons, unleashing swarms of insects, releasing toxic chemicals, and even uprooting themselves to attack human settlements. Elias, back in Oak Haven Cemetery, watched in horror as the trees turned against humanity. The peaceful grove of oaks that had given him so much hope was now a source of dread. The trees were silent, but he could feel their anger, their resentment, their unwavering determination to punish humanity for its transgressions. The world was divided, not just ideologically, but geographically. There were zones of peace and zones of war, regions where humanity had chosen to coexist with nature and regions where it had chosen to fight against it. The future of humanity hung in the balance. Would the zones of peace expand, gradually encompassing the entire planet? Or would the zones of war spread, engulfing the world in a final, apocalyptic conflict? The answer, it seemed, lay in the hands of humanity itself. The choice had been made. But the consequences were yet to be fully realized. Years passed. The zones of peace expanded. Slowly but surely, as more and more communities embraced sustainable practices and learned to live in harmony with nature. But the zones of war persisted, ravaged by environmental disasters and haunted by the silent, watchful presence of the trees. Vivian continued her research, studying the language of the trees, mapping their locations, and trying to understand their intentions. She established a global network of scientists and activists, working together to monitor the state of the planet and to promote sustainable practices. She became a symbol of hope for a world teetering on the brink, a voice of reason in a time of chaos. But even as she celebrated the successes of the environmental movement, she couldn't shake off a lingering sense of unease. The trees, while no longer actively attacking humanity in the zones of peace, remained watchful. Their presence a constant reminder of the delicate balance that sustained life on Earth. Were they truly appeased? Had humanity truly learned its lesson? Or was this just a temporary reprieve, a lull before another, more devastating storm? Vivian couldn't be sure. The trees' silence was ambiguous, their intentions inscrutable. Elias, now an old man, still tended to the trees in Oak Haven Cemetery. The scars of the violence had faded, but the memories remained, etched into the landscape and into his soul. He often sat beneath the peaceful grove of oaks, listening to their gentle rustling, and wondering what the future held. The tree speak had returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a clear, distinct language, but a subtle, almost imperceptible murmur, a whisper on the wind. It was the sound of the trees breathing, of the earth sighing, of a planetary consciousness that was both ancient and unknowable. Sometimes, Elias thought he could understand what the trees were saying. They spoke of patience, of resilience, of the enduring power of nature. They spoke of the cyclical nature of life and death, of the constant ebb and flow of energy. They spoke of the importance of balance, of the need to respect the interconnectedness of all living things. But other times, he couldn't understand them at all. The sounds were just random clicks and groans, Meaningless noise that faded into the background. He wondered if he was simply imagining things, if his mind was playing tricks on him. He looked up at the trees, their branches reaching towards the sky like supplicating arms. Were they praying for humanity? Were they judging it? Were they simply waiting, patiently, for the inevitable? He didn't know. And perhaps, he realized, it was better that way. The ambiguity was a reminder of the uncertainty of life, of the constant need to be vigilant, to be mindful of our actions and their consequences. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The air grew cooler, and the trees rustled in the breeze. Elias stood up, his joints creaking, and began to walk towards the gate. He paused for a moment, turning back to look at the trees. Their silhouettes were stark against the darkening sky, their presence both comforting and unsettling. He could hear their whispers, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of the power and mystery of the natural world. The sounds of the trees were still there, waiting. Their meaning, however, remained uncertain. The fate of humanity, and its relationship with the planet, was still unwritten. The story, it seemed, was far from over.